Today's episode is so awesome, and I am so excited to finally release it. I originally recorded this back in September 2019. I can't believe here we are, mid-May, and I'm finally getting to edit this, but timing is everything, and this conversation actually feels really prescient to release now in Corona times, in a time where the media and meme magic and all sorts of tools of manipulation of thought are running rampant. It's a weird time to be in the middle and to not give in to polarity. You know, the left is screaming their screams. The right is screaming their screams. Everybody's screaming. Everybody's confused. Everybody wants an answer. Everybody wants to find truth. But truth is a nebulous concept. What is truth? If anybody knows where truth begins and ends, please tell me, because I am not quite there. I don't want to give attention to this film, any more attention than it's already been given, but why this conversation today feels really prescient to release is because a film came out recently called Plandemic, which I watched, I sat with, and found to be quite unnerving. For those of you who don't understand what propaganda is, I will drive home the point that propaganda is any sort of media created from a biased perspective to push an agenda. Doesn't matter which side the pendulum swings, media created from a biased perspective to push an agenda is propaganda. And that, to me, is what Plandemic felt like. Poor journalism, the use of the greenish, bluish filter that they use in horror movies like Saw, the lack of credit given to the quote-unquote sources interviewed, the montage of doctors at the end who very well could have just been actors. The filmmaker, whose name I don't even want to say, but is known, and I have seen in the past, use predatory marketing techniques. This person has an agenda, and it's not fair and balanced journalism. It wasn't to showcase the truth in a way that is useful. I meant it when I said it. When I first watched this, is that the way it made me feel is that I was watching woke bro fear porn. And that's that. And, you know, it's funny because back to back, you know, we had that film Out of Shadows come out, which talks about how media can be used as a form of manipulation and psychological warfare. And, you know, that film was interesting, but there was an arc there and it had an underlying, you know, Christian agenda. But you watch that film and then you watch something like Plandemic and you can see how that's a tool for manipulation. Propaganda is propaganda, whether it's from the right or from the left. So I say all of this in the intro leading up to the conversation that I'm sharing today with the incredible Gary Lachman, is that we had this conversation months ago talking about his book, Dark Star Rising, Magick and Power in the Age of Trump, and the use of meme magic and how Pepe, the innocuous, which is a great word, which Gary uses a few times in the interview. Pepe was actually an innocuous meme that was co-opted as a symbol of, as an interesting symbol, that's for sure. So it's co-opted by the right to push an agenda. And it's weird enough, Pepe was also then co-opted in Hong Kong for the protests as a symbol of resistance, which is funny because, you know, my dear friend Jeremy Johnson, who actually introduced me to Gary Lachman, wrote an article for Evolve and Ascend about, you know, meme magic and Pepe and all the stuff with 4chan and Kek. And Kek is the Egyptian god of chaos, and he was a frog god. So it's kind of funny to be living in a time where of course, the chaotic frog god manifests in a mimetic way in the strangest of circumstances. But I digress. This conversation is so awesome. Gary Lachman is an amazing author. Before I was introduced to him personally by Jeremy Johnson, I had actually had his book on Rudolf Steiner, which was a great read. I just love his mind. And it was just really great to just listen to the wisdom that he shared and to just receive insight from this awesome person. So, about Gary Lachman. Gary Lachman is the author of 21 books on topics ranging from the evolution of consciousness to literary suicides, popular culture, and the history of the occult. He has written a rock and roll memoir of the 1970s, biographies of Aleister Crowley, Rudolf Steiner, C.G. Jung, Helena Petrovna Blavatsky, Emanuel Swedenborg, P.D. Uspensky, and Colin Wilson. Histories of Hermeticism and the Western Inner Tradition, studies in existentialism and the philosophy of consciousness, and about the influence of esotericism on politics and society. He writes for several journals in the UK, US, and Europe, including Fortean Times, Quest, Strange Attractor, Fenris Wolf, and his work has appeared in the Times Literary Supplement, Times Educational Supplement, Guardian Independent on Sunday, Sunday Times, Mojo, Gnosis, and other publications. He lectures regularly in the UK, US, and Europe, and his work has been translated into a dozen languages. He's appeared in several film and television documentaries and on BBC Radio 3 and 4, and is on the adjunct faculty in transformative studies at the California Institute of Integral Studies. Before becoming a full-time writer, Lachman studied philosophy and managed a New Age bookshop, taught English literature, and was a science writer for UCLA. He was a founding member of the pop group Blondie, which is one of my favorites, and in 2006 was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Lachman was born in New Jersey, but has lived in London since 1996. So since we recorded this interview back in September, you'll hear Gary talk about a book that was to be coming out in the spring, which is now out and is called The Return of Holy Russia. So a little bit about this book. This book is about a history of how mystical and spiritual influences have shaped Russia's identity and politics, and what that means for the future of world civilization. It examines Russia's spiritual history, from its pagan origins and Eastern Orthodox mysticism to secret societies, Rasputin, Nicholas Roerich, Helena Blavatsky, and Dostoevsky. It also explains the visionary writings of the spiritual philosophers of Russia's Silver Age, which greatly influence Putin today. It also explores what Russia's unique identity and its history of messianic politics and apocalyptic thought mean for its future on the world stage. So this book is available now, everywhere books are sold, on Amazon, Barnes & Nobles, all the things. To learn more about Gary Lachman, feel free to check out his website. It is Gary, Gary, Lachman, LACHMAN.co.uk. This conversation is awesome. I encourage you to take notes. I will offer a lot of links to what we've discussed in the episode show notes on radiomenti.com. And in the meantime, kick back, relax, and enjoy this incredible transmission. Welcome to Radio Menti, embracing the eternal now, where minds and timelines merge, inspiring synchronicity, awakening potential, and making sense of change. Yeah, the idea of meme magic and how that may or may not have played a force in the election of Trump. I know you discussed that in your latest book. Can you kind of explain that whole phenomena to our audience, how it kind of came to be? And
Right. Well, I mean, what I heard about it because of there was a fellow named Harv Bishop who writes a blog about New Thought, and I'm sure your listeners know New Thought is a sort of umbrella term for a variety of different kind of philosophies of mind or mental science, the positive thinking. I mean, the fundamental idea is that, through the mind, we can make changes in reality. Thoughts are things. We can create our own reality through a kind of, intense and sort of repeated imagining of things and concentration on them. And there's a whole history behind that. But Bishop noticed that, there was right after Trump's election, the National Policy Institute, the NPI, which is an innocuous sounding name for an organization that many people believe is sort of a white nationalist group or a white power group or something along those lines. And the head of it is a fellow named Richard Spencer. And he was also the fellow who is said to have founded the alt-right, the alternative right, and so on, and who were behind Trump. And at the beginning of this meeting, which was held in Washington, D.C., in the Ronald Reagan building, Spencer addressed the crowd and was saying, hail Trump, hail our hero, hail our victory. We made this happen. We made this dream come true, and so on and so on. And what got picked up by all the news networks and magazines was the crowd's response to this, because many of them, started responding to Spencer's announcement with Hitler salutes, which Spencer soon explained were actually Roman salutes. But what Harv Bishop picked up on was that the whole idea of making dreams reality, or willing something to happen, was something that's right out of the books on New Thought. And he wondered if Spencer and the alt-right were somehow using New Thought techniques in order to help Trump. And how this seemed to have taken place, if indeed it did, was through the use of what's come to be known as meme magic. And I'll just say briefly, a meme is a term, it's the only valuable contribution to 21st century or 20th century thought that Richard Dawkins has made, as far as I'm concerned. He coined the term meme in the 1980s, and it's the cultural equivalent of a gene. Whereas a gene carries sort of biological DNA and things of that sort, the meme is a cultural equivalent of that, and it can be a slogan or a phrase or an image or a picture or something like that. And when Dawkins coined that term, it was back in the 80s, and so the sort of meme or the medium in which the memes can propagate were old school stuff, were books and movies and TV and radio and magazines and things of that sort. But in our day and age, it's the internet. And the internet is the way in which memes are distributed and disseminated. And what the alt-right apparently did, or Spencer and his colleagues apparently did, was that they had used this cartoon character, Pepe the Frog. It was a creation of a cartoonist named Matt Fury. And he's an amphibian slacker, basically. Pepe came to prominence. He in one of the cartoons that Fury had used to introduce Pepe. He's caught peeing in public. He's urinating in public, and someone says, "Why'd you do that, man?" He says, "It feels good." And this was picked up and spread. And initially, people like Nicki Minaj and Katy Perry and other sort of pop celebrities, they turned up in sort of posts on the internet with Pepe in it and so on. So he was fairly innocuous, playful, fun kind of character, but he became a kind of mascot for a lot of disaffected youth who were really anti-PC. They really hated the whole PC kind of world, the progressive, world, the social justice warrior sort of world of leftist, hyperliberalism, and they saw Trump as their kind of hero because he was the most anti-PC guy around, and so they started posting. They appropriated Pepe and started posting stuff on the internet on this site 4chan with images of Pepe as Trump, or images of Pepe with Trump, or Pepe peering over the wall over Mexico, the Mexican border, or as one of the deplorables and things of that sort. And the idea was that somehow, through saturating the net with these sorts of images, that this would help Trump's campaign. And how that even became something that they even thought about has a strange sort of history to it. And as far as I understand, these guys on the internet, teenagers had sort of nothing else going on in their life, apparently, according to themselves. They even said this in interviews, is that they were really fascinated with the opening scenes of the Dark Knight Rises, the Batman film. And if you know the film, Bane, who's the villain, he's ostensibly being taken to prison on a plane, but he's really in charge. And it quickly turns out that he's in control. He takes over the plane, he escapes, and he sends the plane crashing. And they had some fascination with that, and they posted different bits of that scene online. And then not too long after that, there was the tragic Germanwings 9525 crash in the Alps. And what people doing the posting about the Dark Knight Rises noticed was that there seemed to be a lot of similarities between the scene in the film that they were posting and this tragic plane crash. And one of the similarities was that the plane crashed near a town called Bane. And one of the crash site investigators' name was Bruce Robin. So, of course, Batman's secret identity is Bruce Wayne, and his sidekick is Robin. And that the plane was crashed on purpose. And in the Germanwings flight subsequent investigation, it came out that one of the pilots actually crashed the plane on purpose. So there seemed to be some strange parallels going on. And so the idea was, ooh, wow, did we somehow make this happen? Did we somehow, by posting this stuff on the internet, did somehow an echo of it happen in the real world? Did it bleed over into the real world? And it's very similar to sort of the Slender Man phenomena that was a bit earlier than this, where there were all this weird stuff about this strange, very thin, elongated figure on the net, Slender Man, and all different postings about it. And then there was a strange kind of murder that happened after that. And this phenomena got christened Synchromysticism, which is basically a techno upgrade of C.G. Jung's idea about synchronicity, which is meaningful coincidence, something happening outside in the world parallels in some deeply meaningful way something happening in your head, and there's no causal connection. One didn't make the other happen. They just seem to be related through meaning, and the meaning is so indubitable that it really it strikes you very powerfully. You can't just assume it was just coincidence. And so what I say in the book is that I think we can look at the internet as a kind of exteriorized imagination, or sort of exteriorized collective consciousness. And so if you just translate from something that's happening in your head and the outside world turning up in this meaningful way as a synchronicity to something happening on the net and in the real world, in quotation marks, you can see there's a similarity. So the idea was somehow by saturating the net with these images of Pepe as Trump, or as part of his posse, as it were, that somehow bleeded over into the real world. And this is a kind of variant of a form of magic known as chaos magic. And in saying this, I'm not saying that chaos magic is responsible for Trump or people who practice it have any ulterior motive in trying to get Trump elected. But the reason I say that is chaos magic is a kind of DIY magic, where rather than sticking to the traditional forms and structures and paraphernalia of magic with the magic circle and the wand and incense and a variety of other things, you just use what's at hand. You use whatever's available. And it's kind of started up around the same time as punk rock starts up in sort of the mid to late 70s. And punk rock was a kind of DIY music. You didn't rely on the record companies, and you didn't have to go to the Juilliard School of Music in order to play rock and roll. You just kind of did it yourself. You just kind of used whatever you had available and did it yourself. And so again, when chaos magic first started up, just as with the original medium for Dawkins memes, what was the stuff was at hand then was the all kind of hard copy things in pop culture. So books and movies and records and comic books and things of that sort. But now again in our time, what's at hand are internet memes. And so they somehow transformed this innocuous cartoon character into a sort of magical sigil that, through their imagination and intention and will, they charged with this power. And this was somehow able to help Trump. And so this fellow Harv Bishop is the one who kind of started this chain of inquiry going. And then I just looked into that and followed it up. And along with that, there were quite a few other things happening around Trump, and also in Russia with Tsar Vladimir Putin, that suggested that there was a kind of occult politics going on now.
Well, the occult politics is nothing new. It seems like that's been an undercurrent of the kind of human story for as long as you can even remember. The idea of using symbol to alter consciousness, or word as propaganda. Magic is can be such a fluid thing when you kind of take away like the occult container and look at it as the idea of will transforming reality. That's if we are living in a mental universe, these are just tools to transform reality. So why wouldn't a higher power or powers that be use that tool to transform public perception or opinion?
Oh yeah, sure, but it wasn't out in the open. Put it that way. I mean, you can look back. Obviously, if you want to go back in history, magic and a variety of different forms of hermetic arts were involved in political structures, or even like obviously empires rose and fell depending upon the stars, or depending upon the divination of the shamans and things of that sort. But I mean, in a much more kind of concentrated and in a way, sort of obvious, because a lot of this stuff is in the background. I mean, yes, Ronald Reagan consulted an astrologer, but that kind of came out, after a while. It wasn't like something that was up front. But other ingredients, as I started to do the research for what eventually became my book, Dark Star Rising: Magic and Power in the Age of Trump, was that there seemed to be other things going on at the same time. And one of them was that, okay, you have possibly some Trump fellow travelers using some form of mean magic or chaos magic or new thought in order to help him, get into office. But then Trump himself is a devotee of a variant of new thought, positive thinking. He's his mentor, he himself said, was Norman Vincent Peale. Norman Vincent Peale was an American religious figure who wrote a very, very popular and successful book in the 1950s called The Power of Positive Thinking, that was sort of promoted a kind of Christianized version of New Thought. And I mean, New Thought has its roots back. It goes very, very far back in American culture. You can find it in its roots going back to Ralph Waldo Emerson, the great American essayist, 19th century, and then the late 19th, early 20th century American philosopher William James was very, very interested in it as well. And Mary Baker Eddy and Emma Curtis Hopkins, and so on and so on. So it's sort of there in the background, and it has roots in Hermetic ideas and a variety of other sort of magical sorts of ideas. But Peale kind of made it rather innocuous, Christianized it, and packaged it in a very easily accessible, popular way. And Trump's father was a great devotee of Peale's sermons. And when Trump was a boy, his father used to take the family to hear Peale's sermons, and which he gave regularly at the Marble Collegiate Church on 29th Street and Fifth Avenue in New York. And then when Trump grew up, as it were, he went to the sermons himself. He had two of his weddings took place in the church. Peale officiated at one of them. And I mean, the fundamental idea that Trump took away from listening to Peale, and this was a quote that Peale took from the psychologist Carl Menninger, was that facts don't matter. It's your attitude toward facts that matter. And anyone who's followed Trump's presidency and campaign and career, we know that this is something he took to heart. I mean, facts are something that he doesn't really pay attention to. And since Trump, we live in the time of alternative facts and post-truth and all that sort of thing. And so Trump, grew up and maintains this kind of philosophy. If you ever read any of his own sort of self-help books, like The Art of the Deal, they're full of ideas about positive thinking. And the fundamental idea of positive thinking is that you just keep your focus on what you want. You focus on it, fanatically, really. You have a monomania about it. And as you can see, Trump is very much like that. He has a very narrow band of what he pays attention to. And he directs his attention towards his goals and his aims and all that. And hey, you know what? The guy's president of the United States, and he was a billionaire. So maybe, maybe there's something behind all this sort of stuff. And there was one more ingredient that came up a little bit after the election. In February 2017, the New York Times ran an article about a talk that Steve Bannon, who at the time was still on Trump's bench, he was still, Trump's advisor, and he was also on Security Council, a talk he gave to a select group of very conservative churchmen at the Vatican, a group called the Committee on Human Dignity, I believe. And in amidst all the usual rhetoric about the global Tea Party movement and having to fight Islamic fascism and things of that sort, Bannon starts talking about Putin. And he says he actually likes Putin. He likes Putin because Putin is standing up for traditional values. And he also mentions that in Putin's circle, there's someone who is a reader of Julius Evola. Now, again, maybe your listeners know who Julius Evola was, but for those who don't, he was in many ways brilliant, but very controversial esoteric thinker in the 20th century. And he, in the 1920s, he tried to ingratiate himself with Mussolini. And in the 30s, he tried to ingratiate himself with National Socialism. His political leanings are very much on the right, on the very far right. He fell out with Mussolini because he was critical of Mussolini's fascism, not for reasons that many of us would agree with, but because he felt Mussolini's fascism wasn't fascist enough. Evola had a vision of a kind of pure kind of spiritual fascism that he thought Mussolini wasn't living up to. And after World War II, Evola became this kind of eminence grise in the background in post-World War II Italy. And many of his ideas informed neo-fascist groups that were rising up around then. He died in the early 70s, but his influence still is there today. And people like Richard Spencer and others in the alt-right, they look to Evola as a kind of intellectual leader. He supplies the kind of ideas and philosophy that set them apart from more traditional, conservative right-wing fellows. So they're not just kind of, skinheads and that sort of thing. And so you've got the alt-right supposedly using New Thought methods in order to help Trump. You've got Trump himself, who's a devotee of New Thought in a Christianized variant of it. And you got Trump's advisor at the time saying that he's a reader of Julius Evola. And one of the things about Evola is that he too tried to use magic in order to influence Mussolini. In the 1920s, he was part of a group called the UR group or the group in Italy, and they had a journal, and Evola contributed several articles to their journal, writing under different pseudonyms, but quite a few of the articles that he wrote were precisely about the use of magic in order to change reality, in order to affect events in the real world, and the whole idea that the mind is actually the master of reality. We don't understand this. The magician is the one who comes to understand this and comes to learn how to use these powers. And one of the things he and other members of the UR group were trying to do in the 20s is precisely because they didn't feel that Mussolini's fascists were really up to the job. They tried to instill in them some of the ancient Roman virtues, courage and heroism and so on and so on. And they did magical rituals to try and imbue Mussolini's fascists with these sorts of things. So it struck me, my God, like here's somebody that Bannon and the alt-right, and we know that through Breitbart, Bannon gave the alt-right a platform on the internet, and this was the portal into the collective imagination that they used supposedly in order to help Trump. They're readers of Evola. Bannon's a reader of Evola. Bannon has Trump's ear. Trump himself is a devotee of New Thought, and so on and so on. So it struck me as that all the stuff that people like me who have been reading about for years now, all the stuff that's on the fringe, this occult, esoteric magic stuff, which is generally on the fringe, Main Street culture, it was smack dab in the middle. It was smack in the most powerful places in the world because, again, Bannon was talking about someone in Putin's circle who also read Evola and was also involved in all this kind of stuff. And this was this character, Alexander Dugin, who's still around and who's still, in different ways, his ideas are reaching Putin.
It's so interesting to think, the paradox of the fact of how our mind, imagination shapes reality. And if you look how Trump tweets, he always tweets in this present tense of "in my supreme and ultimate wisdom." He's literally creating with the language he uses. But if our thoughts are causative and we are in this mental universe, that doesn't necessarily just mean it's always going to be for the new car, like the typical new age law of attraction stuff. So if your thoughts are that powerful, I remember reading something somewhere about how the fact that Hillary Clinton had like 500 million, or however much the bankroll was behind her campaign and all of that corporate funding, yet she still lost to him. it there's something to that.
I mean, how should I say? I think it is true that we create our own reality, but I personally, I think the idea of trying to use these techniques in order to, I don't know, gain prosperity. I guess that's sort of what the kind of that's the rhetoric around most of it. That strikes me as a rather shallow, trivial way about it. Because to me, the idea that somehow at some level, which I don't immediately understand and am not immediately in control of, my own mind is intimately involved in the reality that I see out in this outside world. When I close my eyes, it's not there. I open my eyes, and there's this external world out there that, as far as I know, was there before I ever arrived on the scene. That somehow, at some deep, deep level, I'm involved in that. That to me that's enough. That's magic enough. And how is that happening? And what does that mean about reality? And what does that mean about the relationship between ourselves and the world, the inner world and the outer world, and all those kind of philosophical, metaphysical questions? That's sufficient. But I think many of the people who get involved in this sort of thing, they don't really consider all that. They just say, "Oh, gee, I can use this to gain this. I can do." They approach it from a utilitarian point of view, a functional, pragmatic point of view. And again, that was something I discovered, that both chaos magic and positive thinking or new thought share. They were both results driven. It's what chaos magic rose up, as far as I understand, here in England, here in London, in a kind of rejection to the Golden Dawn kind of magic, the more spiritual sort of magic. They weren't interested in having the knowledge and conversation with the holy guardian angel. This was too fluffy and white and nice, and they wanted to make stuff happen. They wanted money to come in the mail tomorrow, or they didn't like somebody and they wanted him to lose his job, or they wanted to shut the dog up next door because it barked too much. So there was, and again, both positive thinking, new thought, and chaos magic, they all share this notion of an achievable reality or a realizable wish. I mean, the first is a chaos magic phrase, and the second is one from Norman Vincent Peale. So again, you don't try to make something that couldn't possibly happen. It's something that could happen. It could happen normally, but for some reason, something's got in the way. Something's preventing you from happening. But with just a little bit of help, a little bit of nudge here, a little extra ingredient of will and imagination, you can tip the forces at play in your favor. And again, it's all about making something happen, some real kind of thing happen. Whereas myself, being a philosopher, if I have to call myself something, I don't really, I'm not interested in making any particular thing happen. I just want to know why anything happens at all. I'm more interested in, like, gee, how did this ever happen in the first place, that we find ourselves here, and what relation does this inner world that I find myself part of, which is as mysterious to me as the outer one is. Most of us walk around, oh my God, the universe happened 15 billion years ago. There was an explosion for no reason, and less than nothing became us now having this conversation. Oh, okay, well, that's fine. That's what Stephen Hawking tells us, so that's fine. Or yes, I've got this thing called the mind, and yes, I have dreams, and yes, and all that. It's like, well, I just think that stops me in my tracks. I think, what, hold on, everybody. Does anybody have any good ideas about this? And so I ransacked the history of philosophy and psychology and all that to try and get some pointers on this kind of thing. So I'm left behind when all these others are out there trying to make stuff happen. And I'm being partially tongue in cheek about this, but I think it is true. And there's a whole, if you know the history of magic, there's many, many warnings about this. It is powerful stuff, but you really have to know what you're doing, and you can call up things, or you can bring forces into play that initially it seems very liberating and powerful and empowering. That's a very dangerous word. I would like to disempower everybody in the world. I don't want to empower anyone anymore. But initially it's very exciting, and then you realize, oh my God, forces have been unleashed that I can't control anymore. So I mean, there's a reason why there's many warnings and ideas about restraint and control and self-discipline and all that sort of thing.
Yeah, the whole kind of be careful what you wish for is actually rooted in a deep truth. And it's funny, even I watched recently the Disney remake of Aladdin, and it's like so terrible, but just the idea is the three
You
wishes,
poor
and I
thing.
know it was on the
Yeah,
plane. I had nothing better to do.
yeah.
Um, but the idea of the genie actually comes from the jinn of Islamic mysticism, and
Yeah, yeah.
that you know, there are forces beyond what our perceivable reality is, and I think that that's something where I really resonate with what you say. I'm definitely more the philosopher as well, where I'm just like, this is insane that we even live where we are and that we're talking on this device and that the neural network of the internet replicates the patterns of the human mind. Like, what? How are we here? And even how I found your work in the first place, which was a funny synchronicity, is that I had picked up your book on Rudolf Steiner and loved it so much. And then, as synchronicity would have it, Jeremy connected us. So, yeah, it's interesting.
Well, I mean, I was going to say Steiner himself talks about that. That's fundamentally, I would say, his fundamental insight. That he says we are not in this. He has a very stilted sort of language, but I'm paraphrasing. He says we're not here in the world to observe a reality that's already made. So we're sort of passive before it. But no, we are actively involved in creating this reality around us. But it's not our ego. It's not our surface sense of self that's going around creating reality. It's some deep level, in us, whether it's the unconscious or the spiritual realms, whatever you want to say. But I mean, that for him to say that, he's not saying, and now that you know this, go home and wish for a new refrigerator, or now that you know this, go home and wish for a car. No, it's try to
Yeah.
understand the try to understand what that actually means, right? And he was, Steiner started up in the late 19th century and into the early 20th century, and he was fighting a battle against the rise of materialism, which was increasingly saying that the mind is, the mind doesn't really exist. You have the behaviorists saying the mind doesn't really exist. The only thing that we can really study is behavior. So forget about consciousness, forget about any kind of inner world. They're not material things. They're not things that we can subject to the kind of measurement, but we can measure behavior. And there's a variety of other schools going on there, which is trying to eliminate consciousness. And you even have it today with people like Daniel Dennett and Nicholas Humphreys and other kind of philosophers of mind that want to sort of eradicate the notion of the inner world as some kind of illusion in some sense. And Steiner was trying to say, no, it's real. And it was all about human reality. It was all about trying to salvage and save our independence as free, spiritual beings in the face of a whole school of thought that was trying to erase that. So, I mean, there were more important things at stake. This is the thing that I find. So, I'm, in one ways, I'm hesitant to use the phrase "we create our own reality" because that, for some people, that immediately puts you in, this particular kind of, practical camp that wants to use it to, be more prosperous. But in another sense, it's a very important. And you mentioned the law of attraction. Well, that's actually a misunderstanding of one of the ideas from Emanuel Swedenborg, who was the great 18th century Swedish scientist and visionary. And for him, the law of attraction, it means that when we die, we first go to this sort of intermediary world that he called the spirit world. And while we're there, our true affections, what we really want, what we really believe, what really is important to us. I'm starting to sound like the Spice Girls, but we are drawn, because of that. We're drawn either to heaven or hell. So it is not that things are attracted to us. Our spirit is attracted either to heaven or to hell, depending on our what Swedenborg calls our true affections. So this got turned around to like, oh no, if you act in a certain way, if you think in a certain way, you will attract certain things to you. This is true, you will, but that's not exactly where the phrase comes from. So there's a kind of misunderstanding in many ways about it's at the basis of a lot of these ideas, I think.
Totally. And even how the ideas are used, just the gross materialism that has kind of emerged from The Secret, and not to kind of trash on it, but it's just, if this is the power and our minds are this all powerful thing, then using them just for selfish purposes to me feels kind of, I, I don't know, is that the most correct use of that power, or is there something deeper than that that could maybe benefit something bigger? I don't know. It's a paradox to me.
Well, I mean, well, for me, again, I said from the perspective I take on it, once you become aware of these kinds of ideas, all that kind of stuff suddenly doesn't seem important anymore. You know what I mean? There are more things. There are more things at stake, whether than you can use your mind in order to make yourself more prosperous. Or again, I'm not saying that's evil. It's not evil, but it strikes me as trivial. That's all. And so
Yes.
I think, in a way, this was kind of the, how should we say it? This I believe this was sort of the reasoning behind all the warnings about sort of magic and all that. It's like, or mind power, or the variety of different things where we can somehow use our mind or imagination in order to, affect reality and change reality. I mean, if you look at the history of magic, there's very, very few magicians who actually ended up, prosperous or well. They actually, most of them didn't. Most of them didn't. I mean, something like Aleister Crowley, who's the great dark magician of the 20th century. Well, he ended up living in a boarding house in Hastings, which was a sleepy seaside town in England, south of London, and he was a heroin addict. He was poor. He left a trail of wreckage. And in saying this, I'm not denying all the good things or whatever you want to call things to his credit, but still, he didn't. The power to change reality. Crowley says, magic is the art and science of causing change to occur in conformity with will. Well, it didn't really work very well for him in the end. So, there does seem to be, and again, this is something that turns up in magical lore and magical tradition. There does seem to be, some law in which you can't use the powers for your own benefit, and if you try to, it kind of backfires.
Yeah, it's the cost that you can have this little bit now, but then ultimately, what you're selling your soul for, if you use that kind of terminology. I'd love to get your thoughts too, which is kind of interesting. So this I've always been fascinated in the theosophy segueing into anthroposophy and just the ripple that Blavatsky's work created. And it feels very kind of synchronous to the conversation we're already having about, sigil magic and how things can be used for nefarious purposes in the wrong hands. There's mixed opinion on this too, but some have said that actually, Hitler had read The Secret Doctrine, and that's even where he had found out about the swastika and all of the occult kind of ripple.
Well, the swastika was around for before Blavatsky wrote the Secret Doctrine. I mean, it's an ancient symbol, and it doesn't matter which way it turns. It turns up both sorts of ways. So, no, to use a good German word, I think that's a lot of Quatsch, which is nonsense. Because I don't think Hitler really had any interest in the occult or magic per se. He certainly knew how to use symbols, and he certainly knew how to sort of dominate large groups of people through his own kind of emotional energies and things of that sort. But if you read the history of National Socialism and all that, I mean, he had all the astrologers and everybody locked up and all that kind of thing. I mean, people like Rudolf Hess, he was actually really interested. He was an anthroposophist, well, or he was a follower of Steiner in many ways. He followed a lot of Steiner's dietary strictures and things of that sort. So no, I think Blavatsky's got a lot of bad press because of that, and because she writes about things like root races and all that. Which, if you know the Secret Doctrine, it's in there, but it's not something that she keeps hammering away at. It's part of the whole story. And in her own life, she had. Well, when she lived in New York, when she turned up in the Lower East Side and 1873, she went to live, on Orchard Street or somewhere like that. It was, the Jewish community. She hobnobbed and mingled with lots of Jewish people. And then later on, when she moved to India, she didn't hang out with the Raj. She didn't hang out with the Europeans or the whites. She went native, and this was one of the things that enraged the Raj, the British there against her. So I don't think Blavatsky was any more or less racist, to put it that way, than many people were at that time. Who this is just part of the general conversation. So I think you can cherry pick these kinds of things and point it out and say, oh, she's responsible for that. But I really don't think that's true at all. And one of the stories that very rarely gets told about Blavatsky is that one of the people who met her in her last days was Gandhi. Gandhi was in London. He was doing his best to be Ben Kingsley. He was studying to be he's the actor who played him in the movie. He was studying to be a barrister or a lawyer in London, and he bumped into two theosophists who actually saw him and they wanted to meet him because they were fascinated with everything Indian. They were fascinated with everything Hindu. And they started talking to him about the Bhagavad Gita, which is, one of the great Hindu religious texts. And they said, wouldn't it be wonderful if we could all read it together in the original language? And Gandhi had to admit he'd never read it in any language because he was brought up and educated by the Christian missionaries. And they told him that all of that is just rubbish and you should forget about it. And they said, well, in that case, you must meet Madame Blavatsky. And so they took him to meet Blavatsky, and he was completely awestruck by her. And from that day on, the Bhagavad Gita became one of the most important texts for him. And for the rest of his life, he had nothing but good words to say about theosophy. And even on his last day when he was assassinated, he wrote highly of it in his journal and all that. But this doesn't get mentioned that much. This one little kind of gossip that Hitler heard about the swastika from Blavatsky. Well, he picked it up probably from these writings, Guido Liest and Lebensfeld, who were putting out a journal about Ariosophy, which was one of the kind of proto-Nazi sort of occult Aryan sort of ideologies that were brewing around that time. And I mean, it's all this stuff about the Thule Gesellschaft, the Thule Society, and Thule was this, supposedly mythic land beyond the North Pole that is in Greek mythology and things of that sort. But the I say proto-Nazi because they were, it was kind of similar Aryan ideas, the whole idea about, German, dominance and so on, and the German race having, a peculiar mission in the world and all that. These were all ideas that were floating around at that time. And you can't blame, you can't, I mean, in some ways, Blavatsky was in the same camp as the philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche. I mean, Nietzsche was appropriated in the same way that Pepe was appropriated by the alt-right. Nietzsche was appropriated by the Nazis in the early days. And because they believed his philosophy of the will to power and all that, lined up very well with them. But then when they actually read him and they saw that, he had very, very good things to say about the Jews. He praised them very much. He talked about their leavening of European culture, and without that, it wouldn't be as powerful or as significant as it was. And even in his last days of sanity before he went mad, sadly, he was writing in letters to people that he wanted to have all anti-Semites shot. A bit extreme, but so I mean, people pick things up and they use them, and what they use gets known through that context, and you really have to make an effort to find out the source of it, and sadly many people can't be bothered to do that.
No, and I mean that is the sad part, because Blavatsky's work has been integral in my journey. Blavatsky,
mm,
Steiner, Alice Bailey.
mm,
I
mm,
the theosophy rabbit hole runs deep for me because I feel like there's such a wealth of wisdom in it, but it's
mm,
incredible to me how much flack or judgment there still is on it, when I mean it's such a wealth.
mm. Well, people can't be bothered. I mean, one of the things I tried to do in my book about Blavatsky was kind of peel away the myth around her. And I mean, it's not that I nailed her. I mean, I don't think anyone can nail it, absolutely, and say, well, here it is. Here's Madame Blavatsky with the bullseye. But what happens is a kind of, how should you say, a mistaken kind of image grows up around these people, and that's what gets understood. And it takes a bit of effort to kind of peel that away. And when you read the vast literature that's written about her, there's so many stories that get repeated that actually, if you do your homework, you find out actually this isn't true, that's not true. I mean, I even myself, I saw that I was repeating things about her because in some earlier writings, I had repeated, other people had said that she smoked cannabis or she smoked hash, and actually she didn't. There's only two. She smoked tobacco. She smoked like a chimney. She did roll-ups constantly, and she was constantly leaving butts all over the place and cigarette ash and all that. But she didn't smoke hashish, and there was only like two articles at different times in her career that mentioned that. And one was early time in her career when a friend of her wrote it, and my impression is that he threw it in to just give it some color, give it some more kind of exotic flavor. Though, yes, she traveled in the East, and in Cairo she did this and that kind of thing. And then later on, when she was being attacked by the spiritualists, because she actually was giving the spiritualists bad press, because she was saying that the entities that the spiritualists are getting in touch with weren't who they said they were. They weren't Aunt Betty, or they weren't Napoleon. They were just astral hobos. They were kind of like etheric street people who have nothing better to do than hang out and wait for somebody to get in touch with them, and they'll tell you they'll say they are whoever you want them to be in order just to have you on and that kind of thing. So there was an article about her written by a spiritualist to kind of get back at her, for her criticisms of spiritualism, that said, oh no, she was addicted to hash or something like that. And if you read her herself, and if you read other accounts about her, no, she was teetotal and she was anti-drug and all that kind of thing. So again, but I had to own up and say, well, actually, I was party to this myself, because I had repeated this misinformation and some other things I wrote about it. So yeah, it takes a bit of homework to kind of get to who these people are. And again, Blavatsky, I think she should be up there with Marx and Darwin and Freud and others in the 19th century, as late 19th century, early 20th century, as one of the creators of the modern world. And I'm really surprised the feminists haven't grabbed onto her, because my God, she was doing remarkable things back then that many men weren't even doing. And if you actually look at her, what she was a free-thinking humanist. She was very progressive for her
Yeah.
time back then, but she gets hauled up often as somehow the source for this kind of far right fascist thinking, which is completely erroneous.
Yeah, and it is a wonder to me that she hasn't been too. I mean, it is funny when you think of like everything that she did in that time frame and where she traveled and who she spoke with and how she was able to synthesize this. And how many books this woman wrote. I
Yeah.
mean, just even scratching the surface of the secret doctrine or Isis Unveiled takes a lot of patience and due diligence, and then just
Oh yeah,
having
sure.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I mean, she's well. I mean, I think you can read her in bits rather than try to get cover to cover. And personally, I prefer Isis Unveiled to the Secret Doctrine, just because it's more. How should we say? The Secret Doctrine is this kind of scripture, whereas Isis Unveiled is more of a book, in the sense like, well, here's my thesis: is that ancient magic was actually a form of science, and she's trying to revive the Hermetic sciences, but she's also looking at the science of her day, and she just brings in lots and lots of sources, lots of references, and you get an idea. It's like one of the first kind of popular magic books, the sort of stuff that people like myself and other people write these days. She was one of the first ones to do that, and there's just so much material in there, and I find it a better read, in terms of reading. I can read. You read a few pages of it and you put it down and pick it up, and that kind of thing.
So for our audience listening, I think it's safe to assume that most of our listeners have esoteric inclinations. But when discussing Blavatsky or Steiner, there's theosophy and there's anthroposophy. So what are the kind of differences between the two, or what's the kind of like the notables of each?
Well, the fundamental difference is, well, theosophy means the wisdom of the gods, and anthroposophy means the wisdom of human. And Steiner broke away from the Theosophical Society in about 1912. This was long after Blavatsky had died. She died in 1891. And it was Annie Besant who was the head of the Theosophical Society at that time. And she herself had a progressive political background. She was involved with the suffragettes here in London. She was involved with the match girl strike and all this kind of stuff. She got arrested for promoting contraception. So she had a whole history of very progressive political ideas and social ideas. She met Blavatsky. She was one of the people like Gandhi, and W.B. Yeats, the Nobel Prize winning poet, was another one who met Blavatsky in London, and she was converted. And the fundamental difference is that theosophy had become focused on the East. It was Blavatsky and Colonel Olcott were one of the first Europeans to convert to Buddhism, and they did it publicly when they went to India. And so it's focused on Hinduism and Buddhism and the wisdom of the East, and where Steiner recognized there was a mystical tradition in the West that was being overlooked. And Blavatsky didn't have too many good words to say about Christianity or the Judeo-Christian tradition. And Steiner was adamant that his own approach would be, from the Western esoteric perspective, and it's Christocentric. I mean, for Steiner, what he calls the mystery of Golgotha, Christ's crucifixion, is sort of like the key event in human history. For Steiner, it marks the ascent of the spirit back to the higher worlds. And in his vision of cosmic and human evolution, we start out part of the spiritual worlds, but through a gradual process of materialization, we descend from that. And by the time of Christ, the kind of hardening of our spirit that we see in the material world around us had reached its lowest point, and there was a need to reconnect with the spiritual worlds again. Otherwise, humanity would be lost. And so Christ's descent from the higher worlds into our worlds marked the beginning of this return, this kind of upward. This is sort of a V shape. Up there, we come down. The bottom point of the V is the lowest point of our descent into matter, and that's where Christ incarnates, and then it begins the other side of the V, going back upward. And this is over thousands and thousands of years, so it's on a grand scale. And basically Steiner, he wanted to, along with showing that there was a whole Western tradition going back to Plato and the Hermetics and Neoplatonism and all the stuff that we recognize as the Western esoteric tradition today. He also believed in the sense that each of us, through our own efforts, we can reconnect with the spiritual within us. And so it was discovering the spiritual within the human rather than looking for it in the gods. And that's a bit of a thumbnail kind of way looking at it. But he was very much about learning how to awaken the spiritual powers or forces within ourselves. And if we know his book Knowledge of Higher Worlds and its Attainment, he talks about how within each of us there slumbers these spiritual forces that we can awaken, but we have to go through this practice. And he was also he tried to approach it scientifically, where Blavatsky doesn't quite do that. She doesn't really sort of give you exercises. She had a special esoteric group in her last days where she taught certain exercises, but it wasn't something that was sort of part of the general kind of theosophic approach. There was sort of general ideas, broad ideas, but Steiner kind of walks you through step by step, these different practices and exercises and things of that sort that you could follow. So it was from his point of view, it was more scientific discipline sort of thing. And he also had a background in German philosophy, so idealism, philosophers like Kant and Hegel, and he wrote a book about Nietzsche and things of that sort. So it was a bit more intellectual, put it that way, than the theosophical approach.
Yeah, and even starting from childhood, Rudolf Steiner was the creator of the Waldorf schools, correct?
No, this is true. Yeah. That's one of the things. I mean, that was another thing too. There was a much more practical approach. Steiner had his hands in lots of pies. He started the Waldorf schools in about 1919, just after the war. In his last days, he gave lectures about agriculture, and it was out of that the biodynamic farming came out, which is a very popular form of organic farming these days. He also anthroposophical health. He developed a sort of form of homeopathy. And prior to that, all of his work on arts. And this is another thing that was sort of absent in the Theosophical Society. There's a story where while he was still a member, I mean, he left the Theosophical Society over Krishnamurti. This was the breaking point. He and Annie Besant were at loggerheads for a while. But then when she and Charles Leadbeater wanted to promote Krishnamurti as the avatar of the age, Steiner just couldn't take it anymore. And so that was kind of the thing that did it for them. But prior to that, I think it was 1906, and I think in Munich, there was a theosophical conference was held. And Steiner pulled out all the stops. and doing it. And he created this remarkable kind of artistic interior with different paintings and colors and music and all this sort of stuff that didn't, none of that really played into the earlier theosophical kind of thing. And so he created a whole different approach to it. And if you know, well, he was influential in architecture too. There's a whole system of anthroposophical architecture. There's the Goethe Anum in Switzerland, in Dornach, and in different places in the world, there's different buildings that are built according to anthroposophical principles. I mean, here in London, there's Rudolf Steiner House, which is built according to that way, and you can find it in different places too. So he was a polymath in that sense. He was like an old school, Central European polymath who had his hands in lots of different things.
Yeah, it's just, the art and music and architecture, all these things seem like they would be completely, synchronous to having such a strong philosophy. So it's interesting that in theosophy they didn't have as much emphasis on that, because I feel like art and music are such important vehicles for helping you see the world in a deeper way.
No, it's true. I mean, I don't know why that's the case. It just seemed to be sort of the case. And but I think one of the other thing that gets left out when you're talking about theosophy and talking about Blavatsky is, like, one of her central things was really this idea of the brotherhood of man, this universal brotherhood, and that came out of her background in Freemasonry. I mean, her great uncle or her grandfather was a prominent Freemason in Russia in the 18th century. And one of the central ideas that she picked up from that was this whole notion of the brotherhood of man, or brotherhood of humans. It just doesn't sound quite as good to say
Yeah.
that. Or brotherhood of people. Oh, it can't be brother. I don't know what it can't. Is it brother and sisterhood? I don't know. I don't want to offend anybody. So the everything hood of everyone. But the whole idea was, regardless of race, creed, color, bank account, political background, in this context here, we are all together, we're all equal, and we're all one. And this is one of her central ideas that she really tried to bring across. And we're still working on that today, but this was something that she really put a lot of her time and energy into.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting. The thing about today, being that it seems like it's almost hypocritical in a lot of these movements where it's like we're all one, but then, the us versus them mentality, divide and
Mm,
conquer mentality is still so
mm,
strong.
mm.
So we still seem like there's a lot of work to be done.
Yeah, well, it's true. It's true. Well, again, this is what I'm saying about these ideas about how our somehow, which we don't understand, we are responsible for the world around us. I mean, that should, as I said, that should stop us in our tracks. That should be enough for us to have to deal with. But we still somehow, oh, okay, fine, I'm going to use that power in order to make money happen or something like that. It's just, but that's what I meant about. I mean, if you really twig, as they say here, that this is true, it should have a lightning bolt effect on you. It should be a transformative kind of effect where your perspective changes. You put things in context, and trivial things are seen to be trivial, and there are much more important things at stake here. And that's, how should I say it? The one power that I would want to have everyone have and enjoy would be the ability to recognize what's important and what's not, and to stop wasting your time on the things that aren't important.
Yeah. Yeah, I really agree with that too. It's been an interesting journey of kind of my own path of looking at these
Mm,
things, and it's kind of the rub. It's like the deeper you go and the more you learn, the more you realize how little is actually needed to be happy and to be in awe
mm,
and to be filled with wonder. So,
no,
placing
sure.
emphasis on things, and it's like, is this a thing that's really going to feed happiness, or is it just to fill a
Mm.
void? You know?
Well, we all need things. We all need a place to live. We all need to eat, and all. There's nothing wrong with that.
Mm.
But those are all means toward an end, rather than an end in themselves. I mean, this is, and again, all the great religions teach this. All the great, and I'm I'm a convinced perennialist in the sense that I think there's a fundamental revelation that's at the heart of all the great religions and the great philosophies and all that. And we can't sum it up in so many words, but it is something along the lines of recognizing that there's something more important than all of that. There's something. I mean, the fundamental mystical insight is, of course, and what people like myself and others try to do the best we can is try to unpack what that of course is about. And I mean, and I would say, the content of mystical experiences isn't any different than the content of everyday experience, but you see that from the right perspective. You see it from this perspective that shows you, the difference between what's important and what's trivial. And sadly, in this world, everything gets mixed up, and we lose track of all that. And if we're lucky, a few times in our life, we might have that kind of revelation. And if we're even more lucky, something from that revelation seeps into us, and it changes us, and we try to live according to it. But I would say that's the fundamental thing.
Well, your work really helps open up doors of potential and possibility to see the world in that way, and I'm really grateful for what you've put out into the world, because it's been very inspiring on my path as well. For our listeners, do you have anything new in the pipeline?
Well, I've got a book coming out in the spring, called "The Return of Holy Russia." It's sort of a follow up to Dark Star Rising, because in Dark Star Rising, I do devote a chapter to the occult politics that's been going on in Russia for some time. And that was a springboard into looking into Putin's attempt to resurrect the idea of Holy Russia. Because in the 19th century, that was what Russia was called, was Holy Russia. And Russia was kind of the last bastion of Christendom. And this was the whole thing that Bannon was talking about Putin being, a believer in traditional values and all that. And that starting with that, what I wound up writing was a kind of history of Russia from the point of view of the mystical and religious and spiritual impulses behind it. So that's coming out in the spring. And what I'm working on now and doing the reading for is a book about precognitive dreams, which is something I've wanted to do for a while, because I've been keeping off and on a dream journal, God, for about 40 years now. More keeping it more times than others. But throughout that time, I've jotted down quite a few dreams in which it seems I've got a few patches of the future. So I can't predict the winners at Aqueduct, or who's gonna win the election, and it isn't sort of premonitions of some disaster, but it's just, if I write my dreams down, I pay attention to what happens to me that day, the next day, and I notice, oh my God, I dreamt exactly that. You know, and again, it's usually trivial sorts of things, although sometimes it's the things that are less trivial. So I'm looking into, well, how could that possibly happen?
Yeah.
How could it be? How is it that we could possibly do that? Because, according to our usual ideas about reality and time, past, present, and future, the future hasn't happened yet. So how could I get a glimpse of it? But I'm not the only one. There's many, many people out there. And I tell you, I gave a talk in London earlier this year about this. And the next day, I saw on Twitter that someone who was at the talk said, I went to this wonderful talk, well, whatever it's talk by me, Gary, and about precognitive dreams. And oh my God, it's true. And what she posted was that she dreamt that she had picked up a hedgehog, which is a creature that's common in England. I don't think they get them too much in the States. It's kind of like a little porcupine sort of thing, and it was in the street. So she picked it up and took it out of the street and put it, on the sidewalk, so it would be out of the way of cars, out of harm. And the very first thing she saw in her Twitter feed was a post about how to protect the hedgehog.
Wow.
So she dreamt that. Then she even saw on Twitter. She was on Twitter. So she said it's true, and I think it is true. It's nothing special. I'm not claiming any special power. I've just noticed this, and I think anyone out there, if you keep a dream journal, and keep a day journal, or just pay attention to what happens in your day, you will see over time that, oh my God, bits and pieces of the future have turned up in my dreams. And there's different people have written about it, and I'm going to look at what they had to say and write about my own experiences and see what I come up with.
Oh, that sounds amazing. I can't wait to read it. That's very synchronous on my journey. I'm very much a dream precog trying to figure it out.
There you go. There you go. Yeah. Well, again, synchronicities, coincidence, precognition, they're all kind of blended together. So I'll be looking at all those things.
Amazing. Well, we look forward to the launch of your new work, and thank you for taking time to have this chat. And
My pleasure.
it's been wonderful.
Well, all right. Well, let's talk again in the future sometime.